In 1973, 120 descendants of the richest man in American history gathered for a family reunion. Not one of them a millionaire. His name was Cornelius Vanderbilt. And this is the story of how $100 million fortune, the largest in the world, simply vanished. Section 1, The Rise of 1530. Visual. New York Harbor, early 1800s. Sailing ships. A young boy rowing a small boat. Before he had a fortune, Cornelius Vanderbilt had a rowboat. In 1810, at 16 years old, he borrowed $100 from his mother to buy a small ferry. His job was simple: carry passengers and cargo between Staten Island and Manhattan. It was glamorous work. Cold water, long hours, thin margins. But Vanderbilt understood something most people in his position didn't. He understood that the boat wasn't the business. Efficiency was the business. He undercut competitors on price. He worked longer hours than anyone else on the water. And slowly, that $100 rowboat turned into a fleet of steamships. By the 1840s, people had started calling him the Commodore, a nickname that stuck for the rest of his life, even though he never served in a navy. Here's where the story could have ended. A successful shipping magnate, comfortable, respected, done. Instead, Vanderbilt did something almost nobody in his position was doing. He looked at a new technology everyone else considered a passing fad, and he bet everything on it. Railroads. Visual. Steam locomotive, 1860s. Rail lines spreading across a map of the Northeast. In the 1860s, already in his 60s, an age when most wealthy men were retiring, Vanderbilt began buying railroad stock. Not small positions, controlling stakes. He consolidated several small, inefficient rail lines into a single, dominant company, the New York Central Railroad. It became the essential artery connecting New York City to Chicago and the rest of the growing industrial nation. Think of it like this: if shipping had made him rich, railroads made him a king. Whoever controlled the tracks controlled how fast America could grow, and Vanderbilt controlled the tracks. By the time he died in 1877, Cornelius Vanderbilt's estate, roughly $100 million. To put that in perspective, that sum was, by some estimates, greater than the entire cash reserves held in the United States Treasury at the time. Adjusted for the size of the American economy today, historians and economists have placed his fortune in the range of the largest ever accumulated by a single American. He hadn't built a company. He had built the richest family in the history of the country. So how does a fortune that size, a fortune bigger than the government's own cash reserves, completely disappear within 4 generations? Beat. That's exactly where this story turns dark. Section 2, The Peak 300-630. Visual. Fifth Avenue, New York, 1880s to 1890s. Rows of ornate limestone mansions. When Cornelius Vanderbilt died, he made a decision that would define, and ultimately doom, the family. Rather than dividing his fortune among his 13 children, he left roughly 95% of it to a single heir, his eldest son, William Henry Vanderbilt. It was a calculated move. Cornelius believed that splitting a fortune weakened it. Concentrate the wealth, keep it under one disciplined hand, and it would grow rather than dissolve. For 1 generation, he was right. William Henry took a fortune of about $100 million, and in just 9 years of careful management, doubled it to roughly $200 million before his own death in 1885. At that moment, The Vanderbilts weren't just America's richest family. They may have been the richest family on the planet. Visual. The breakers, Newport, Rhode Island. Sweeping aerial shot. Marble house. Biltmore Estate in North Carolina. And then came the spending. William Henry's children, the third generation, inherited a fortune so large it seemed impossible to spend. So anyway. Newport, Rhode Island became their playground. The Breakers, a 70-room Italian Renaissance-style mansion built for Cornelius Vanderbilt, was designed to look less like a house and more like a European palace, because that was the point. Marble House, built for William Kissam Vanderbilt, reportedly cost around $11 million in 1892 dollars, a staggering sum for what the family openly called a summer cottage. And in North Carolina, George Washington Vanderbilt II built Biltmore Estate, still to this day the largest privately owned house in the United States. Over 175,000 square feet, 250 rooms. Here's the strange part. These weren't just displays of wealth. In the family's mind, they were investments in something more valuable than money: status. In Gilded Age America, the Vanderbilts' problem old money looked down on. They were new money, railroad money, ferry boat money. The mansions, the balls, the marriages arranged with European aristocracy. All of it was an attempt to buy something that couldn't simply be inherited: social legitimacy. They succeeded spectacularly. By the 1880s and 1890s, the Vanderbilts were arguably the most socially powerful family in America. But you cannot buy legitimacy without also buying its price tag. And nobody at the peak of the party was doing the math on what all of this actually cost to maintain. Because a mansion with 250 rooms isn't a monument. It's bill. And that bill doesn't stop coming just because the party's over. Section 3. The Hidden Weaknesses, 6:30 to 10:30. Visual. Ledger books, dust settling on old paper. A single candle burning down. Every empire has a fault line hiding beneath its foundation. For the Vanderbilts, there wasn't just one. There were four, quietly working against them at the exact moment the family felt most invincible. The first fault line. The fortune kept splitting. Cornelius Vanderbilt's strategy, concentrate the money in one heir, only worked for one generation. William Henry didn't make the same choice. He split his $200 million fortune among his 8 children. Reasonable on the surface. Fair, even. But think about what that math actually does over time. A fortune split 8 ways is roughly $25 million per child. Split again among their children, and again among the next generation. And within a few generations, you're not looking at a family fortune anymore. You're looking at dozens of much smaller ones, each expected to sustain a Gilded Age lifestyle that was built for a $100 million income, not a $25 million one. The second fault line, none of the money was working. Here's a metaphor worth remembering. A fortune is like a fruit tree. If you only eat the fruit and never plant new seeds, eventually the tree stops producing, and you're left with nothing but the memory of harvests. Cornelius and William Henry had planted seeds, ferries, then railroads, businesses that generated new income every single year. Their descendants, for the most part, stopped planting. They lived the harvest. They spent from principle, not just from what the fortune earned. A mansion doesn't generate income. It only consumes it in staff wages, in property taxes, in maintenance, in heating costs for 250 rooms. The third fault line, The world around them was changing. The federal income tax, introduced permanently in 1913, took a bite out of investment income that simply hadn't existed during Cornelius's lifetime. Then came the federal estate tax, which meant that every time the fortune passed to the next generation, the government took a share before the heirs even got their hands on it. Multiply that across 4 generations, and you're not looking at one big loss. You're looking at compounding losses at every single handoff. The fourth fault line, and perhaps the most human one, nobody was building anymore. The first 2 generations of Vanderbilts were builders, obsessive, disciplined, hungry. The generations that followed were, for the most part, raised into wealth rather than raised to build it. There's an old saying, often summarized as shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. The idea that the first generation builds a fortune, the second maintains it, and the third, having never known scarcity, loses it. It's a pattern historians have observed across many wealthy families, not unique to the Vanderbilts, but few families illustrate it as dramatically. Visual. A slow fade from a bustling ballroom to an empty, dust-covered hallway. None of these 4 fault lines on their own would have destroyed the family fortune. Splitting inheritance is normal. Spending on status is normal. Taxes are normal. Even a generation without a builder is, on its own, survivable. The problem is that all 4 were happening at exactly the same time, and the family throwing the world's most extravagant parties had no idea they were standing on a structure with cracks running through every single pillar holding it up. Beat. The party was about reality, and reality doesn't send an invitation. Section 4, the turning points, 10-10-30 to 1500. Visual, stock ticker tape, newspaper headlines from 1929. A railroad map fading into disuse. If the fault lines were the disease, several specific moments were where the symptoms became impossible to ignore. Turning point 1. The railroad itself stopped being the future. The very industry that made the Vanderbilts the richest family in the world was, by the early 20th century, no longer the unstoppable growth engine it had once been. Automobiles were becoming affordable. Trucking began eating into freight business. Highways would eventually do to railroads what railroads had once done to canal boats. The Vanderbilts' core asset, the thing Cornelius had bet everything on, was slowly becoming a fading industry, and much of the family's wealth was still tied to it. Turning point 2, the Great Depression. By 1929, the market crash that wiped out fortunes across America didn't spare the Vanderbilts. Stock values collapsed, real estate values collapsed, and crucially, the family's spending habits, built during decades of assumed limitless wealth, didn't collapse nearly as fast as their income did. Imagine running a household budget built for a $100,000 salary, and then your income drops by half, but your mortgage, your staff, and your habits stay exactly the same. That gap is where fortunes bleed out. Turning point 3. The mansions became liabilities, not assets. This is perhaps the most painful irony in the entire story. The very houses built to prove the family's wealth eventually became the clearest evidence of its decline, because nobody could afford to keep them anymore. The Vanderbilt mansions along Fifth Avenue in New York, once a stretch so dense with family palaces it was nicknamed Vanderbilt Row, were by the mid-20th century almost entirely demolished, torn down, not preserved as monuments, but knocked flat, often replaced by office buildings and apartment towers, because maintaining them was no longer financially sustainable, and the land beneath them was worth more than the houses themselves. Even Biltmore Estate, the crown jewel, the largest house in America, nearly met a similar fate. The costs of running it were so enormous that the family eventually had to open it to the public as a tourist attraction just to keep it standing. Think that the ultimate symbol of Vanderbilt wealth survived by turning itself into a business that charges admission. Turning point 4. The money simply ran out quietly, family by family. There was no single dramatic crash for the Vanderbilt fortune, no headline mourning when it all disappeared. It was slower and, in some ways, sadder than that. Each generation inherited a smaller slice. Each slice was taxed. Each slice funded a lifestyle, still calibrated to Gilded Age standards. And piece by piece, branch by branch of the family tree, the fortune simply thinned out until there wasn't much left to thin. By the time we reach the mid-20th century, descendants of the once wealthiest family in the world were working ordinary jobs, not out of some noble choice to reject inherited wealth, but because in many branches of the family there was very little wealth left to inherit. And that brings us to the moment that turned this from a private family story into a public legend. Section 5. The Collapse, the 1973 Union, 1500 to 1800. Visual. Vanderbilt University campus, 1973. A banquet hall filling with guests. Old photographs projected on a screen. In 1973, roughly a century after Cornelius Vanderbilt's death, more than 120 of his descendants gathered at Vanderbilt University for a family reunion. According to an account later published by family biographer Arthur T. Vanderbilt II in his book on the family's history, when a reporter asked if there was a millionaire among them, the answer that came back was silence, because there wasn't one. Let that sit for a moment. 120 descendants. A man who, less than 100 years earlier, held a fortune comparable in scale to the entire United States Treasury. And in that room, a single millionaire. It wasn't theft. It wasn't a single catastrophic scandal, though the family certainly had its share of public dramas over the decades. It wasn't even, primarily, bad luck. It was the slow, compounding arithmetic of the 4 fault lines finally reaching their conclusion: division, consumption without reinvestment, taxation, and a fading entrepreneurial spirit, all playing out quietly across 4 generations until the math simply ran out of room. Visual. A single mansion window, curtains drawn, lights off. Here's the metaphor that captures it best. Imagine an enormous block of ice, the size of a house, sitting out in the sun. On day 1, it looks eternal, solid, massive, untouchable, but it's melting the entire time, in ways too slow to see from one afternoon to the next. Nobody looking at that block of ice on day 1 believes it will be a puddle by day 100. But it always is. The Vanderbilt fortune wasn't stolen from the family. It melted generation by generation, in full view of everyone, and almost nobody noticed until it was nearly gone. By the time the family gathered at that 1973 reunion, the name Vanderbilt still commanded instant recognition. It was, and still is, attached to a university, to grand historic homes now run as museums and tourist sites, to a place in American history books. But the fortune that built all of it had, in practical terms, dissolved into the branches of a family tree too wide and too far removed from its source to hold the weight of what one man built with a single rowboat. The name survived. The money didn't. And that gap between legacy and liquidity is the quiet lesson at the heart of this entire story. Section 6. The Lasting Legacy 1800 to 2000. Visual. Present-day Biltmore Estate. Tourists walking the grounds. Vanderbilt University campus today. The Breakers, now a museum. So what's left of the Vanderbilt empire today? Physically, quite a lot. Biltmore Estate still stands in Asheville, North Carolina, now owned and operated by Descendants as a private tourism business, drawing over 1 million visitors a year. The Breakers and Marble House in Newport are preserved as museums, run by a historical preservation society, open to the public who pay admission to walk through rooms the family itself could no longer afford to maintain privately. Vanderbilt University in Nashville, founded through an 1873 donation from Cornelius Vanderbilt, remains one of the most respected universities in the United States, carrying his name forward into a purpose he likely never fully imagined. But the liquid fortune, the stocks, the controlling interest in railroads that once made this family the wealthiest on the planet, that is essentially gone, dispersed across generations of descendants living no different, financially, from millions of other Americans. There's something almost poetic about it. The buildings survived by becoming public. The name survived by becoming a brand rather than a bank account. And the family survived, in the end, not as dynasty, but simply as people, spread out, ordinary, carrying a famous surname into unremarkable lives. The Vanderbilts didn't just lose a fortune. They became, unintentionally, the most famous case study in American history of how wealth can vanish, not through catastrophe, but through time itself. Section 7. The Comparison 2000-130. Visual. Split screen. Old Gilded Age mansions beside modern Billionaire Estate photos. The Vanderbilts weren't alone. The shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves pattern has echoed through other American dynasties. Pieces of the Astor fortune, built on New York real estate in the 19th century, thinned dramatically across generations in similar ways. Even today, family business researchers frequently cite studies suggesting the overwhelming majority of family wealth doesn't survive intact past the third generation, regardless of how large the original fortune was. Compare that to families like the Rockefellers. While also facing division of wealth across many descendants, built structures like family offices, trusts, and professional wealth management specifically designed to counteract the same fault lines that dissolved the Vanderbilt fortune. The difference wasn't the size of the original fortune. Rockefeller's fortune, adjusted for the economy of his era, was arguably even larger than Vanderbilt's. The difference was structure, that systems built to survive human nature, rather than simply trusting each generation to make disciplined choices on its own. Which raises the uncomfortable question at the center of this entire story. Section 8. The Key Lesson 2130-2300. Visual. Slow zoom on a $1 bill, then pull back to reveal it sitting in an empty, grand hallway. If the richest family in American history could lose it all within 4 generations, what does that tell the rest of us? It tells us that a fortune isn't a fixed thing you inherit and keep. It's more like a fire. It needs constant fuel, constant attention, or it simply burns down to embers no matter how large the initial blaze. Cornelius Vanderbilt understood this instinctively. He never stopped building, never stopped reinvesting, never assumed the fortune could simply take care of itself once it existed. His descendants largely believed the opposite, that wealth of that scale was permanent, self-sustaining, immune to time. It wasn't, and history has shown again and again that no fortune is. The lesson isn't that wealth is dangerous or that spending is inherently foolish. The lesson is about the gap between building and maintaining, and how few families across history have managed to teach each new generation the discipline of the first. Callback and closing 23:0 to 24:30. Visual. Return to the opening image. The crumbling mansion gate, ivy over stone. Slowly fade to a photograph of the 1973 reunion. We open this story with a single fact: 120 descendants of America's richest man gathered in one room, and not a single millionaire among them. Now you know how it happened. Not with crash, not with a scandal splashed across newspapers, but with 100 years of splitting, spending, taxing, and forgetting. A fortune melting in plain sight while the world assumed it would last forever. Cornelius Vanderbilt built an empire from a $100 rowboat and turned it into the largest private fortune on earth. His descendants inherited the boat, but not the hunger that built it. And in the end, that difference was enough to turn the richest family in America into a name on a university gate, and nothing more. Visual. Fade to black. If you think this story is remarkable, wait until you hear what happened to the family that was once considered even richer than the Vanderbilts, before losing it all in less than a single generation. That's next.